The rusted chain clanked, a sound swallowed instantly by the vast oppressive silence that followed it. I pushed open the heavy, corrugated metal gate, its hinges groaning like tortured souls, and stepped onto the crumbling asphalt of what used to be the main yard. Above me, a leaden sky pressed down, mirroring the weight in my chest. This was it. The old penitentiary. My inheritance. My refuge. I'd spent the last year drowning in a sea of noise, a relentless tide of demands, expectations, and the suffocating hum of a life I no longer recognized as my own. The city had become a hostile entity, its constant thrum a drill boring into my skull. Every conversation felt like an interrogation, every crowded street a personal invasion. When the solicitor's letter arrived, detailing an obscure, distant relative's final bequest, this sprawling, derelict prison facility in the forgotten reaches of the state, it felt less like an inheritance and more like a macabre invitation. An invitation to the very edge of the world, where the only company would be my own thoughts and the ghosts of forgotten men. It was precisely what I needed, or so I fiercely convinced myself. My sedan, a small, incongruous splash of modern life against the monolithic gray of the prison walls, sat parked outside the perimeter fence, already gathering a fine layer of dust. I hadn't bothered to bring much. A duffel bag of clothes, a box of well-worn books, a battered old typewriter, and a stack of blank paper. I intended to write, to exorcise the demons of my own past by crafting new ones on the page. I needed a place devoid of distractions, a place so stark, so utterly devoid of human warmth, that it would force me to look inward. I'd found it. Perhaps too perfectly. The air here was thick with the scent of dust, damp concrete, and something else. A faint metallic tang that I couldn't quite place. Rust, perhaps. Or something deeper, more visceral, like dried blood and old fear, baked into the very fabric of the stone. The main administration building was a skeleton, its windows shattered, gaping like empty eyes. I bypassed it, my gaze fixed on the imposing windowless block at the far end of the yard, distinct even from the other cell blocks by its sheer, grim finality. The death row corridor. That's where I intended to start my new life of quiet desperation. I'd studied the blueprints the solicitor provided, detailed maps of a structure designed for maximum security and minimum hope. The corridor was tucked away, a cul-de-sac of despair, sealed off from the general population. It offered the kind of profound isolation I was seeking. Or so I told myself. It was the furthest point from any conceivable human interaction, a sanctuary of ultimate severance. The inner gate, even heavier than the first, was unlocked, hanging slightly ajar. It swung inward with a faint groan, revealing a long, narrow hallway, dimly lit by the slivers of light filtering through grimy, barred skylights high above. My footsteps echoed, each crunch of debris under my boots amplified, asserting my presence in a space that felt stubbornly resistant to it. The corridor itself stretched out, a tunnel of pale, peeling institutional green paint, flaking like diseased skin from the walls. On either side, heavy steel doors, each marked with a faded number, stood sentinel. These weren't the flimsy bars of a typical cell block. These were solid, unyielding slabs of metal, designed to contain the condemned until their final walk. It felt full of echoes, full of unspoken final words, full of the last breaths drawn behind these very doors. I could almost hear the low hum of nervous energy, the frantic prayers, the resigned sighs. At the very end of the corridor, past the last numbered cell, was a slightly larger room. This was the execution chamber according to the blueprints. I didn't approach it. Not yet. The thought alone was enough to make my stomach clench. I stopped at cell number 7. It was as good a place as any. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a tiny, windowless space, just a concrete slab for a bed, a bolted-down toilet, and a small, barred vent near the ceiling. It was utterly devoid of personal touches. stripped clean of any humanity it might once have held. A tabula rasa, but one carved from despair. My breath plumed in the frigid air. This was where I would stay, at least for a while. It was the ultimate retreat, a place where the world could not reach me, and I could not reach it. Setting down my duffel bag, I looked around. The only source of natural light was the sliver from the corridor's skylights, reflecting dimly off the pale green walls. The artificial light fixtures were long dead, wires dangling like severed nerves. I pulled out my headlamp and clicked it on, a small, defiant beam cutting through the gloom. As the beam swept across the ceiling, it caught something. A faint inscription, scratched deep into the concrete above the bed slab. I leaned closer, my heart thumping a little harder. "The clock stops here." The words were crude, defiant, yet filled with an unbearable sorrow. A final message from a man whose time had run out, etched into his very tomb. I was alone, truly alone, in a place steeped in endings. The solitude I craved was here, in abundance. But it wasn't the peaceful, restorative quiet I had envisioned. It felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. And for the first time since I'd embarked on this grim pilgrimage, a tendril of genuine unease began to coil in my gut. I had come seeking quiet, but I was beginning to suspect I had found something far more profound and infinitely more terrifying. My breath plumed in the frigid air, each exhalation a ghostly cloud in the dimness of the corridor. Intentional. I had come seeking quiet, a place where the clamor of the world couldn't reach, where I could focus on my work, on my thoughts. The closure notice on the gate had been an invitation, promising undisturbed peace. I found a relatively clear section of the corridor near a cluster of cells and began to unpack my bag. My thermos, my notebook, a few tools I might need for minor repairs or documentation. As I bent to retrieve a pen, a faint scrape reached my ears. It was soft, like something dragging against stone, but distinct in the profound stillness. I froze, my hand hovering over the bag. "Hello?" My voice sounded absurdly loud, swallowed by the vastness. No response. I listened, straining. Nothing. Just the slow, deliberate drip of water somewhere far off, a sound I hadn't noticed before. I straightened, scanning the empty cells, the vacant guard stations. Just the building settling, I murmured to myself, the words feeling thin and unconvincing even to my own ears. This place was old, decaying. Of course, it made noises. Wood groaned, metal rusted, stone shifted. It was a natural consequence of abandonment. I picked up my pen, my heart still a little too fast, and tried to concentrate on the task at hand. A few minutes later, as I was jotting down some initial observations about the state of the wall plaster, a flicker caught my eye. Too fast to be real, too indistinct to be anything but a trick of the light. I snapped my head up, my gaze darting to the spot. "Tired eyes," I muttered, rubbing them roughly. And too much stress. My work had been demanding lately, the deadlines relentless. I forced myself to look back at my notebook, to anchor myself in the tangible. I found myself glancing up more often, my senses suddenly hyper-aware, straining to catch another glimpse, another sound. The solitude I had yearned for was beginning to feel less like freedom and more like exposure. Later, I decided to explore a small, unused office just off the main corridor. It was mostly empty, save for a rusted filing cabinet and a single, rickety wooden chair. I pushed the chair aside to get a better look at some faded documents scattered on the floor. When I returned to the corridor, something was different. My thermos, which I had carefully placed on a stable ledge next to my bag, was now lying on its side, a few inches from where it had been. It hadn't fallen. It was simply moved. Not dramatically, not knocked over with force, but subtly, as if someone had nudged it and then laid it down. I stared at it, a knot tightening in my stomach. Did I leave it like that? I picked it up, feeling its familiar weight. No, I was meticulous. I always ensured things were stable. The ledge was flat, no vibrations, no gusts of wind in the sealed-off section. I distinctly remembered setting it upright. Lost in thought, distracted. Maybe I nudged it with my bag when I bent down earlier. It was a plausible explanation, one I clung to desperately. My own forgetfulness, my own clumsiness. Anything but anything else. I began to feel an unsettling sensation, as if I wasn't truly alone. The air, already frigid, seemed to drop a few more degrees around me. I continued my work, but my focus was shattered. Every creak of the building, every rustle of dust, every shift of my own weight seemed amplified, interpreted through a lens of growing suspicion. I kept my head down, trying to ignore the prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the feeling of unseen eyes. It wasn't a word, not really, more like a sibilant breath, a soft, dry sigh right next to my head. I flinched, spinning around, my heart hammering against my ribs. Draft, old building. But there was no wind down here, no discernible draft. The corridor was sealed. My rationalizations were becoming threadbare, tattered excuses barely covering a rising tide of primal fear. The solitude I had craved was now a suffocating shroud, and I was beginning to suspect I wasn't the only one wrapped within its folds. I gripped my pen so tightly my knuckles ached, a desperate attempt to ground myself in the mundane. The air itself felt heavy, laden with the echoes of despair. Each step I took sent a scuttling sound ahead of me, a phantom of some unseen creature or merely the dust of ages disturbed. They were scarred with countless marks, crude carvings, scratched-out names, dates of finality, a morbid tapestry of final thoughts. The sheer scale of suffering contained within these walls was overwhelming, a palpable weight that settled deep in my chest. I paused at what must have been a small auxiliary office or ES station, tucked away at the far end, half obscured by a fallen section of plaster. Unlike the austere cells, this room had once held a desk, now overturned and splintered, and a single rickety chair. It felt less like a place of confinement, and more like a place of observation, of administration. My artist's eye, always seeking out the unusual, caught on a faint discoloration on the floorboards near the far wall. It wasn't rot, but a subtle difference in the wood's grain, a slight elevation that suggested an uneven patch. Curiosity, a relentless itch, compelled me. I knelt, pushing aside a drift of dust and debris. The floorboard wasn't merely uneven, it was loose. With a grunt, I managed to pry it up, revealing a shallow, narrow cavity beneath. Inside, nestled amongst more dust and desiccated insects, lay a small, leather-bound book. It was old, its cover cracked and peeling, but surprisingly intact. A faint metallic scent, like dried blood and rust, emanated from it. This wasn't just a book, it was a journal. My heart began to pound with a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I carried it back to the faint light filtering through a grimy window further down the corridor, settling on the overturned desk. My fingers, trembling slightly, traced the faded gold lettering on the spine. Ledger of Souls. This wasn't just a record. It felt like an accounting. I opened the journal, but as I delved deeper, the handwriting began to change. It grew frantic, the ink bleeding, the lines slanting wildly. The entries shifted from objective records to increasingly unhinged personal observations. They say justice is blind. One entry read, dated decades ago. But I see everything. I see the rot beneath the skin, the pestilence in their hearts. The state extracts a life, but what of the essence? What of the lingering stain? Another page, scrawled with an almost illegible ferocity. The warden. He speaks of a cleansing, not merely of the condemned, but of the very air they breathe. He insists the spirits linger, that their despair feeds something. He has begun to Experiment. My breath hitched. Experiment? The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken horrors. I flipped through more pages, each one more disturbing than the last. There were references to the ritual of severance, to the quiet disappearances of inmates not officially recorded as executed. The warden, referred to only as H, seemed to have descended into a profound madness, convinced he was purifying the facility, severing not just lives, but souls, preventing them from contaminating the world. H says they are the residue, the echoes. He believes by altering the final moments, by extending the agony of their release, he can prevent their return. But some vanish entirely. No trace. The grim past wasn't just a series of executions. It was a history of rituals, of souls being tormented and perhaps, truly, erased. I closed the journal, the metallic scent now sickeningly potent. My hands were shaking. The solitude, once suffocating, now felt predatory, as if the unseen forces H had written about were gathering, drawn by the opening of their ancient wounds. I reached for my sketchpad, an automatic response to overwhelming emotion. My fingers, usually precise, moved with a frantic energy I rarely experienced. The lines weren't my usual clean architectural forms. Chains, not just confining, but somehow consuming. The elongated figure from H's sketch reappeared on my page, but now imbued with a terrifying, almost predatory grace. My usual palette of muted, earthy tones was replaced by stark contrasts of black and crimson, the colors of decay and spilled life. The cabin, this facility, wasn't merely old. It was steeped in something ancient and malevolent. It was filled with a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through the very concrete beneath my feet. A sound not audible as much as it was felt, a pressure in my chest. It was the sound of a vast, ancient hunger echoing through the desolate death row corridor. The air, already thick with the scent of decay and forgotten fear, now felt charged, electric, as if the very atoms were buzzing with a malevolent energy. I spent the first few days trying to impose order, to map the facility, to understand its layout. But the layout shifted. Not physically, not in a way I could explain, but the sense of direction, the perception of space would warp. I'd walk down a corridor I swore I'd just come from, only to find myself in a section I hadn't yet explored. The rows of cell doors, each one a monument to despair, started to blur into one another. The numbers painted on the walls, once crisp, now seemed to bleed, to run like tears. Then came the sleep, or lack thereof. My nights became a succession of vivid, terrifying nightmares that clawed at the edges of my sanity. Faces would materialize in the periphery, indistinct, shifting forms in the gloom, their eyes burning with an ancient, unspeakable malice. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs, the metallic tang of fear thick in my mouth. The lines between sleep and waking began to fray. I'd drift off in a rickety office chair, only to wake up hours later sprawled on the grimy floor of Cell Block C, my head throbbing. No memory of how I got there. The disorientation was a constant companion. I'd stare at my hands, feeling a strange detachment, as if they belonged to someone else. What had I been doing an hour ago? Had I eaten? Had I even spoken aloud? The answers were quicksilver slipping through my grasp. Was it Tuesday? Or was it Friday? Had I been here for days or weeks? The calendar I'd tried to maintain in the small administrative office now looked like a child's scribbles, random marks and crossed-out dates that made no sense. I ran a hand over my face, feeling the stubble, the exhaustion etched into my features. It was the logical conclusion, wasn't it? Extreme isolation, a deeply unsettling environment. My mind, a fragile instrument, was simply breaking down. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just stress, a vivid imagination, a trick of the light. But then a door, far down the corridor, would creak open, slowly, deliberately, when I knew for certain I had secured it. It wasn't just auditory. The intrusions became physical. A sudden, icy breath on the back of my neck when I was alone in the shower room. A fleeting pressure on my shoulder like a phantom hand, urging me forward or perhaps holding me back. I'd spin around, my heart leaping into my throat, only to find empty space, the air still and heavy, the fluorescent lights humming their sickly tune. I started talking to myself, not out of loneliness, but to confirm my own presence, to hear a voice that was undeniably mine. "It's just the old building settling," I'd mutter, my voice thin and reedy in the vast emptiness. Just the wind. But there was no wind down here, no open windows. The facility was sealed, and the sounds weren't the groans of old wood or shifting foundations. They were deliberate, purposeful. The gnawing feeling of not being alone escalated into a full-blown paranoia. Every creak was a footstep. I found myself checking behind me constantly, my neck stiff from the effort, my eyes scanning the gloom. The feeling wasn't just that something was here, but that something was watching me. Always. From the corners of my vision, from the depths of the empty cells, from the very air I breathed. It felt like 1,000 unseen eyes, pressing in, dissecting every move, every thought. They were dissecting me. And they were. Not always, not dramatically, but subtly. A pen rolled to the floor, a book closed, a chair slightly askew from where I left it. These weren't tricks of the light. These were undeniable, tangible shifts. And with each one, the last vestiges of my certainty crumbled. I was not alone. And whatever was here, it knew my name. It was playing with me, and it was slowly, meticulously unraveling my mind. I started leaving small, personal markers, a pen on a specific corner of a desk, a book open to a particular page, just to see if they would be moved. It was a desperate, almost childish game, but one I felt compelled to play. My markers sat undisturbed, mocking my growing paranoia. Then, on the third day, a pen I'd left perfectly aligned on the edge of Ez's desk was nudged ever so slightly off-kilter. Not fallen, not rolled, but shifted, as if by a careful, unseen hand. My breath caught. I tried to rationalize it. A draft, the building settling, my own clumsy hand. I realigned it, pressing it firmly into place, then left a heavier, less susceptible marker, a thick, leather-bound journal, open to a specific page. When I returned an hour later, the pen was still in place. My heart gave a hopeful flutter. Then I walked to cell 13. The heavy steel door, which I had locked behind me, was still shut. But through the grimy viewport, I could see the journal. It wasn't just moved. It was flung. It lay crumpled against the far wall, its spine broken, pages splayed. My stomach lurched. No draft, no settling building could have done that. Not with that force. I fumbled with my key, my hand suddenly clumsy, my mind racing. What could have done this? A rat? No, the journal was too heavy. I was the only one here. I pushed open the door to cell 13, the hinges groaning in protest. The air inside was like an ice bath, a stark contrast to the stagnant warmth of the corridor. I stepped in, my gaze fixed on the abused journal. As I knelt to pick it up, something else caught my eye. Scratched into the grimy concrete of the floor, directly beneath where the journal had been, was a single deep gouge mark. Fresh. Raw. As if something with immense strength had clawed at the ground or been dragged across it. A low, guttural thump echoed from the far end of the corridor near cell 1. It wasn't the creak of the building or the drip of a pipe. It was a solid, heavy impact, followed by a faint, dragging sound, like something being pulled across rough stone. The hair on my arms stood on end. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee this place, but a morbid curiosity, a terrifying need for confirmation, held me captive. By the time I reached cell 1, my breath plumed in front of me. The cell door was a solid sheet of rusted steel, coated in decades of dust and grime. And there, pressed into that thick layer of dust, was a handprint. Not a smudge, not a vague outline, but a perfectly formed, distinct impression of a human hand. Large, long-fingered, and impossibly fresh. The dust around it was disturbed, as if the hand had pressed with incredible force, a desperate final grasp. My ability to rationalize snapped. The logical part of my brain, the part that had clung to drafts and settling foundations, shattered like glass. This was undeniable. This was real. And then, from inside. Cell 1, a low, choked gasp. It was wet, ragged, and utterly terrifyingly human. It lasted only a second, but it was enough. Enough to tear through the last vestiges of my composure. I spun around, my legs burning, and ran. I ran towards the exit, towards the faint rectangle of light that promised escape. But the corridor seemed to stretch before me, endless. The exit light flickered, dimmed, then brightened again, mocking me. Each step was a monumental effort, as if the air itself had thickened, pressing against me, slowing my desperate flight. A deep, resonant hum began to vibrate through the floor, rising from the very foundations of the building. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears, but a tremor that pulsed through my bones, through my teeth, through the marrow of my being. It was a presence, immense and suffocating, growing stronger with every beat of my frantic heart. The hum intensified, turning into an undeniable magnetic pull. It wasn't physical, but it was just as strong. My legs, which had been pumping moments before, slowed, faltered, then stopped. I tried to force them forward, but it was like fighting an invisible current. I was not leaving. I was being held. The hum wasn't just in the air now. It was in my bones, vibrating through the concrete floor, up my spine, and into the very marrow of my being. My will, once a sturdy anchor, felt like a frayed rope, unraveling strand by agonizing strand. Not discrete words, but a cacophony of voices, overlapping, indistinct, yet undeniably present. They spoke of despair, of finality, of a hunger that stretched beyond human comprehension. My vision blurred, the flickering emergency lights strobing erratically, painting the corridor in grotesque, fleeting tableau. I saw faces pressed against the grimy cell bars, not spectral apparitions, but fleeting, distorted impressions of anguish, eyes wide with incomprehensible suffering, mouths open in silent screams. The corridor wasn't just a place of death, it was a canvas of it, and I was being forced to witness every stroke. My hands, which I tried to clench into fists, felt sluggish, heavy, as if an invisible force was pressing down on them. A low, guttural moan, not my own, seemed to ripple through the air, vibrating the dust on the floor. The metal, already freezing, seemed to leach warmth from my touch, leaving my fingers numb. Then, with a soft, almost imperceptible click, the heavy bolt on the door beside me slid back, as if released by an unseen hand. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the overwhelming pressure of the entity. This wasn't just a haunting. It was an invasion. It wasn't content to merely observe. It wanted to consume. I tried to back away, but my legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. The hum intensified, becoming a piercing drone that threatened to shatter my eardrums. Give. Give. The essence, they hissed, a chorus of starved voices. The vision, the truth, our eyes. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my palms against my temples, trying to block out the assault, but it was useless. Within that maelstrom, I saw shapes. They were not individual entities, but facets of a greater, singular hunger. They were the echoes of every lost soul, every despairing breath taken in this desolate place, woven into a monstrous tapestry of malevolence. It spoke not into my ears, but directly into my mind, bypassing all barriers. The unmade, the forgotten. We yearn for form, for light. My art, that was what it desired. It wasn't just my soul it craved for sustenance, but my gift. It wanted to see through my eyes, to create through my hands, to express its own horrific existence into the tangible world. It wanted to twist my artistic vision, to pervert it into a conduit for its own unspeakable horrors. It didn't want to possess me. It wanted to become me, to hijack my very essence as an artist, show them our truth. The magnetic pull intensified, dragging me, step by agonizing step, towards the open cell, towards the ultimate horrifying commission. I was no longer an artist. I was merely a vessel, and the entity was preparing its first masterpiece. Come inside. The words weren't merely spoken. They were woven into the very fabric of the air, vibrating in my bones, tugging at the frayed edges of my sanity. My rational mind screamed for retreat, but a deeper, more primal fear, intertwined with a desperate dying ember of hope, held me rooted. This wasn't just a place of death, it was a place of hunger, and I was the meal. I clutched the tattered journal, its brittle pages now my only scripture, my only guide in this infernal labyrinth. Somewhere within its frantic scrawl I had found it, a desperate, archaic ritual, scribbled by a former warden, a man clearly driven to the brink, who believed he could sever the ties that bound the others to this cursed ground. A fool's hope, perhaps, but it was all I had left. My hands trembled, not just from fear, but from the adrenaline coursing through me. I'd spent the last precious minutes, while the entity had seemed to recede slightly, gathering what I could. A shard of flint for scratching, some coarse salt I'd found in a forgotten supply closet, and a dried sprig of something resembling mugwort from a crack in the courtyard wall. Crude tools against an ancient evil, but the journal insisted on their potency. With the flint, I scraped a crude, jagged circle, then an intricate, almost forgotten symbol within it. A stylized eye, meant to reflect and bind. It felt childish, like a child drawing a monster to make it go away, yet the warden's frantic notes had sworn by it. As I finished the symbol, I fumbled for the salt. My fingers were numb, clumsy. I poured a thin, wavering line around the circle, creating what I hoped would be a barrier, a boundary the entity could not cross. The salt shimmered faintly in the dim glow of my dying flashlight, a stark white against the gray. For a fleeting second, a flicker of something akin to hope, fragile as a moth's wing, stirred in my chest. Maybe, just maybe. Then came the incantation. The journal had warned that it must be spoken with conviction, with a soul ablaze with will. My soul felt like a guttering candle, but I tried. I held the dried mugwort, its scent faintly herbal against the metallic tang of fear, and began to chant the words I had memorized. Sanguis et terra, spiritus et os. Vos habite, vos exite, vos non estis domus. Blood and earth, spirit and bone, you depart, you exit, you are not home. The air in the corridor grew heavy, thick and cloying, like breathing through wet wool. I pressed on, my eyes fixed on the symbol, my voice rising in a desperate crescendo, trying to imbue each foreign word with power, with expulsion. For a moment, a glorious, agonizing moment, it felt like it was working. My heart surged. It worked. I did it. A triumphant, if terrified cry almost escaped my lips. Then the backfire. The salt line, my precious barrier, didn't just dissolve. It erupted. Black, viscous tendrils, like roots of some infernal plant, burst from the concrete beneath the salt, shattering the white crystals, consuming them in an instant. They writhed, coiling and uncoiling, reaching for me. The symbol I had so painstakingly drawn with the flint began to glow, not with the protective light I had envisioned, but with a malevolent, pulsating crimson. It pulsed with a sickening rhythm, like a monstrous heart beating beneath the floor, drawing power from my very attempt to banish it. The mugwort in my hand withered, crumbling to black dust, the protective scent replaced by the stench of scorched earth and decay. The growl from Cell 13 was no longer distant. It was everywhere. It filled the corridor, the cells, my very skull. It was a roar of triumphant ancient laughter, echoing off the walls, distorting the very space around me. It wasn't just an absence of light anymore. It was a presence, vast and formless, yet undeniably there. It stretched, it pulsed, it filled the doorway, blocking out any faint sliver of light from deeper within the cell block. It was an oceanic wave of pure, unadulterated malevolence, and it was breaking over me. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, falling hard onto the concrete floor. The journal flew from my grasp, sliding across the floor and coming to rest perilously close to the encroaching tendrils of blackness. Inky mass in the cell doorway. They spoke of my futility, my arrogance, my pathetic attempts. They spoke of their power, their dominion, their hunger. I wasn't just fighting a ghost. I was fighting the very essence of this place, an entity so deeply ingrained, so utterly overwhelming, that my human efforts were less than a fly buzzing against a hurricane. My countermeasures hadn't just failed. They had only served to awaken the beast further, to show it how truly powerless I was. Despair. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was a physical weight, pressing down on me, crushing the air from my lungs. My hope, that fragile dying ember, was not just extinguished. It was crushed, ground into fine dust beneath the entity's triumphant, unseen heel. Despair was the taste in my mouth, the metallic tang of fear and something far worse, a taste of ash and forgotten suffering. The old death row corridor, already a tomb, began to weep. Not water, but a thick, viscous fluid that oozed from the cracks in the ancient concrete, glistening wetly in the dim, flickering emergency lights. It smelled of rust and something cloyingly sweet, like decaying roses left on a fresh grave, forming swirling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe with an unseen current. Then came the sound. It was the screams of the condemned, the pleas of the innocent, the triumphant cackles of their executioners, all woven into a single, deafening roar that vibrated through my very bones. My teeth chattered, my vision blurred, and I clutched my head, trying to shut out the cacophony, but it was inside me now, a tempest raging in my skull. The walls themselves began to breathe. They pulsed, expanding and contracting with a slow, sickening rhythm, like the chest of some enormous dying beast. Phantom faces, gaunt and terrified, flickered into existence on the pockmarked surfaces, their eyes wide with unutterable horror, their mouths silently screaming. They were the faces of every soul who had ever passed through this corridor, every life extinguished, every hope annihilated. My skin crawled, prickling with phantom touches, as if 1,000 unseen hands were reaching for me, probing, caressing, violating. The air grew heavy, thick with a suffocating pressure, as if the very atmosphere was solidifying around me, trying to squeeze the life out of me. My chest tightened, my lungs burned, and I gasped for breath, but only managed to inhale the putrid stench of decay and something else. Something ancient and hungry. "You are mine, Blake." The voice finally spoke. No longer a chorus, but a singular, impossibly deep resonance that seemed to originate from the core of the earth itself. It wasn't in my ears. It was in my blood, in my marrow, in the very essence of my being. Your hope is dead. You are an empty vessel, ready to be filled. A blinding flash of light, white and searing, erupted from the end of the corridor, momentarily eclipsing the flickering bulbs. When my vision returned, the light had coalesced into a swirling vortex of pure, agonizing energy, black at its heart, pulling at the very fabric of reality. It was not a physical being, but a manifestation of pure, predatory will. I offer you a choice, Blake, the voice continued, now laced with an almost seductive quality, a promise of twisted solace. Surrender. Let me in. Become us. The pain will cease. The fear will end. You will know power beyond your mortal comprehension, a consciousness spanning eternities. Your soul will merge, become something greater, something eternal. As it spoke, visions flooded my mind, not of torment, but of an unsettling, profound peace. I saw myself, no longer Blake, but a part of something vast and powerful, observing the rise and fall of civilizations with detached indifference, untouched by suffering, unburdened by mortality. It was a terrifying allure, the promise of an escape from the agony, an end to the ceaseless struggle, a cessation of the frantic, desperate beating of my heart. Then the alternative slammed into me, a brutal, visceral countervision. If I refused, I would be consumed, not merely killed, but utterly annihilated. My mind would be torn apart, synapse by synapse, memory by memory. My body would become a husk, animated by its lingering torment, a puppet of eternal agony, forever trapped in this corridor, a silent scream etched onto its decaying face. The choice hung heavy in the air, a monstrous dilemma that tore at the last vestiges of my sanity. To surrender and become a horrifying echo of my former self, a part of the entity's twisted will, or to fight, to endure an unimaginable, eternal shredding of my very essence. With no guarantee of escape, only the certainty of prolonged, exquisite suffering. My soul was on the scales, and the weight of that decision threatened to shatter me completely. My eyelids felt heavy, cemented shut with a gritty residue, and when I finally forced them apart, a sickly, yellowed light assaulted my vision. Above me, a cracked, low ceiling stretched into a murky distance, adorned with what looked like ancient water stains and the skeletal remains of long-dead insects. I lay sprawled on a floor that was less stone, more a mosaic of decaying linoleum tiles and grimy concrete. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, rust, and something else. Something metallic and vaguely sweet, like old blood. My head throbbed, a dull, relentless drumbeat behind my eyes, and every muscle in my body screamed in protest as I tried to shift. This wasn't the cabin. My mind, still a fractured mess of images and sensations, grappled with the jarring reality. But the vortex was gone. Or I was. I pushed myself up, groaning as a fresh wave of pain shot through my ribs. My hands were scraped, the knuckles raw, and a deep gash ran along my forearm, crusted with dried blood. My clothes were torn, caked in dirt and something else I didn't want to identify. As my eyes adjusted, the grim tableau of my surroundings solidified. I was in a corridor, narrow and claustrophobic, lined on one side with what appeared to be heavy, rusted steel doors. Each door bore the faint, faded imprint of a number, and a small, barred window, like a vacant eye, stared back at me. This was a prison, an old one. A death row corridor, perhaps, marked for closure, left to rot in its own forgotten torment. The very air felt heavy with the ghosts of final breaths. The cabin. The word echoed in my mind, a phantom limb. It felt like a lifetime ago, a different world where the struggle had been raw, visceral. I remembered the tearing, the rending, the desperation of that fight, the way the very walls had seemed to scream with me. That place, I knew, bore the scars of my desperate, bloody stand. What had I even won? Survival? At what cost? The profound sense of wrongness that had begun in the cabin, that had intensified with the vortex, now permeated this new, grim reality. It was deeper, an internal dissonance. It felt as if I had been flayed, not just physically, but spiritually, leaving me raw and exposed to something fundamentally terribly amiss with the world. My legs, unsteady and trembling, carried me to one of the barred windows. No sky, no horizon, just an endless gray confinement. Each step I took sent a jolt of agony through my battered frame, but the need to understand, to escape, was a primal urge that superseded the pain. I had faced down something monstrous, I knew that much. But I hadn't come out unscathed. I hadn't come out whole. The victory over the vortex, over whatever it had been, was a lie. It was a new cage, perhaps one forged from the very essence of my shattered mind, or a place I was meant to be, a consequence of the choice I'd made, or had made for me. The wrongness wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was the very fabric of my existence. This wasn't the cabin, not anymore, but it was just as much a prison. The air here was dead, heavy with the phantom scent of despair and old iron. There had to be an end. There had to be an escape. The walls seemed to press in, the ceiling to lower, but I refused to break. I wouldn't be trapped here. Not again. I stumbled, scraped my hands on the rough stone, but kept moving. The illusion, the manifestation, whatever this new cage was, it had to have a weakness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a faint, almost imperceptible light bled through a distant archway. Hope, a fragile, trembling thing, flickered within me. I ran, my legs screaming in protest, towards that distant promise. The archway led not to another corridor, but to a sudden, jarring shift. The concrete floor vanished, replaced by damp earth and fallen leaves. I was outside. The cabin stood before me, stark and silent against the gray dawn, its windows like vacant eyes. It was over. I was out. Relief, potent and dizzying, washed over me. I didn't look back at the cabin. I couldn't. My car, miraculously, was still where I'd left it, partially obscured by overgrown brush. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys, the engine sputtering to life with a cough and a roar that sounded like a defiant scream in the quiet woods. I put the car in reverse, tires spitting gravel, and didn't stop until the cabin was a distant, forgotten speck in the rearview mirror, and then, not even that. The drive was a blur of adrenaline and exhaustion. But I was out. I was safe. The first sign was subtle. Just the empty interior of my car. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was just my mind playing tricks, I reasoned, a lingering effect of the trauma. I finally reached a small roadside diner, a beacon of normalcy. The smell of stale coffee and frying bacon was a comfort. Faint, almost inaudible, like dry leaves rustling in a wind that wasn't there. They were at the very edge of my hearing, a murmur of distorted voices, just beyond comprehension. I gripped my coffee mug, my knuckles white. When the waitress brought my food, I tried to smile, but my lips felt stiff. As she turned away, I caught my reflection in the diner's window. My eyes, usually a clear hazel, seemed different. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving me staring at my own terrified face. The food tasted like ash. The warmth of the diner felt like a lie. I felt a profound, unsettling shift within me. A sense of something having latched on, something that had ridden shotgun all the way from that accursed cabin. It was in me. A piece of that horror, a fragment of its boundless malice, had burrowed deep. I paid for my untouched meal and stumbled back to my car, the ordinary world now feeling like a thin, fragile veil. The horror wasn't left behind in the woods. It had followed me. It had become a part of me. The ordinary world, the one of traffic lights and indifferent faces, felt like a flimsy stage set, easily torn. I drove, but not with purpose. My hands were on the wheel, but the direction felt preordained, a magnetic pull I couldn't resist. My car, a familiar extension of myself, became a vessel on a predetermined course, carrying me back to the place I had sworn to escape. The old prison. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was an anchor, a gravitational force that had snared my soul. I found the service gate ajar, a silent invitation, or perhaps a sign of its impending demolition, its slow, deliberate dismantling. The air grew heavy the moment I stepped onto the cracked asphalt of the old yard. The main building loomed, a monolithic tombstone against the bruised sky. My feet knew the path, leading me through the skeletal remains of what was once the administrative wing, past the collapsed guard towers. The door, heavy and rusted, groaned open at my touch, a sound like a dying sigh. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of damp stone and forgotten lives. But it was more than just a smell. It was a taste, metallic and bitter, coating my tongue. I stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind me with a soft, final thud that echoed not just in the corridor, but in the cavern of my chest. The corridor stretched before me, an endless tunnel of despair. They swirled around me, through me, not distinct voices, but a collective moan of anguish, an eternal echo chamber of suffering. Each cell I passed felt like a pressure point, a memory waiting to erupt. But it wasn't just sight. It was a profound, empathic connection. Their fear became my fear, their despair my own. The veil between the past and present, between me and them, was not just thin. It had dissolved completely. Then, at the very end of the corridor, where the faint light struggled to penetrate, something shifted. It wasn't a physical manifestation, no ghostly figure or spectral apparition. It was a presence, vast and ancient, a culmination of all the suffering that had ever been contained within these walls. It wasn't outside me. It was within the very fabric of the corridor, and now it was drawing me in. I stopped, my breath catching, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. A profound sense of loss and emptiness that was not my own. It wasn't taking my soul. It was filling it. I felt my own identity begin to unravel, my sense of self fraying at the edges. Blake. The name felt distant, like a forgotten word. My hands, I noticed, were trembling, but not from fear alone. There was an odd sensation, a tingling, as if countless tiny tendrils were reaching out from within my skin, connecting me to the stone, to the air, to the very essence of the corridor. Me. When I opened them again, the world had subtly changed. I looked at my reflection in a grimy window pane, or what I assumed was my reflection. A faint, almost imperceptible shimmer seemed to cling to my skin, like dust motes caught in ancient light. I was the corridor. I was the echoes. The entity hadn't possessed me. It had merged with me, absorbing my identity into its own vast, timeless suffering. I was a vessel, yes, but a vessel for an ocean of despair, forever flowing, forever present. I turned slowly, no longer feeling the need to escape. Where would I go? It was inside me now. It was me. I walked back the way I came, the heavy door still ajar. The night air hit my face, but it offered no relief. The world outside was still there, vibrant and oblivious, but it was just a fleeting illusion. It had walked out with me, silently, eternally, and it would never let me go.